plan events for all 1,800 political science students, events like this that allow you to meet your profs in an informal setting and talk to them over some coffee, bagels, or wine at nighttime. We'll have 2 more events coming up. We encourage you to come. We have a charity event at Gertz on March 24th, and on April 6th, this is the big event that I encourage all of you to come. It's April 7th. It's a Thursday, and it's going to be at the Faculty Club, which is unprecedented for an undergraduate association. It's going to be our Professor of Words and Journal launch. So we'll be launching the McGill Journal of Political Studies, which is the first undergraduate publication actually on the open source system of the library, and we'll be giving out awards for Best Professor of the Year, Course of the Year, Canadian Course of the Year, Comparative Course of the Year, these sorts of things. So it'd be fantastic if you could come out, support your profs. It's kind of going to be our version of like the Grammys. This year they'll be giving little speeches, hopefully. So really encourage you to come out. It's going to be beautiful. The Faculty Club will have all sorts of hors d'oeuvres and a little bit of wine there. Okay, and if you have any questions about the Political Science Youth Association, I encourage you to come up and talk to either me or Ida or Roland, who's here from exec. And I hope you enjoy our research brunch. So without further ado, I'd like to present Professor Leo Baccini. He's a new hire. He's our first year here. And we'll be talking about FDI, or well, he'll let you know. Thanks.
She has a question for you, though.
Oh, sorry, quickly. Thank you, Professor. Just wanted to say we're accepting nomination kits for the PSSA executive, which Michelle didn't mention. So it's due Wednesday at 5 p.m. You need 25 signatures to be a vice president and 30 for a president nomination. Thanks so much. Thanks, Professor.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here to present my research agenda to you. Some of you might know me, but some might not, as I just joined the department a few months ago. It seems already a long time ago, but it's just a few months. My name is Leonardo Baccini. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. Before coming at McGill, I was an assistant professor at the London School of Economics. And before that, I was a research fellow at Princeton, NYU, and at a research institute in Italy. My research interests, broadly speaking, fit in the field of political economy. In particular, my PhD dissertation was on international trade and international organizations, and I will talk mostly about that in this talk about international trade and international organizations. This is my email. That's my office. On my webpage, you can find like the list of my publications, my book with Oxford University Press on economic reform in developing countries, and other publications. But especially, I think, if you're interested in my research agenda, I would like push you to look at like my working papers, because those are like the projects on which I'm working on, and I would really benefit from comments or your help. So I decided basically to talk about 3 current projects, which are like basically 3 papers. My research agenda is actually like fairly broad. Like one of the pleasure of like the advantages of being a professor is that you can like basically like move from one project to another as you please, more or less, as far as you publish. And so like I actually like to branch out like quite a lot. But let me focus on projects mostly on international political economy. The first one is I'm very interested in the design of international organizations in general, and in particular of preferential trade agreements. This was like my dissertation. So I spent many years together with 2 colleagues, Andrea Dewar and Manfred Elsig, to collect a huge data set on the content of preferential trade agreements. So if they regulate investment, if they regulate intellectual property rights, labor standard, human rights, all those issues that are, like, for example, discussed heavily in the negotiation of the TPP. And this data set is now available. If you have like this presentation, you click on this data set, you would have a web page. You can download all the data set and play with that and go wild with the data set. I'm using the data at the moment to explain the coevolution of 3 components of the design of international organization: the depth of the treaty, meaning that how strict the commitments are, like how heavily countries decide to regulate investment or intellectual property rights. On flexibility, another component. So how easy is to like shirk a commitment, to avoid cooperation if cooperation is too costly without having to withdraw from the agreement. And enforcement, how strict cooperation is. And we show, using like a technique called network analysis, that those 3 components co-evolved over time. In order to have a deep agreement, you have to have like a lot of flexibility, because a deep agreement produces like large adjustment costs, and so countries have to be able to stop cooperating if adjustment costs are too large. And similarly, like if you want to have a deep agreement, you also have to design a strict agreement with, for example, a credible dispute settlement mechanism, because otherwise the commitments are just de jure, and like they're like purely like formal and do not have a bite. And we show that like indeed cooperation, at least in trade agreements, have co-evolved over time, meaning that like agreements are becoming like deeper, so like more commitment, easier like somehow to like avoid cooperation if cooperation is too costly, but at the top of that also agreements are more serious. They're like there is more of a serious enforcement mechanism. My second project that's really I think hot as a topic. We go and check if it's really true that multinational companies win the game in case of preferential trade agreements. So that's like the rhetoric if you think about the TPP now, right? The TPP is basically an instrument to like give a lot of power to few, a handful of multinational companies. And what we find using like, we are lucky to be able to use the entire like in a data set with the entire like number of US affiliates all around the world. And we see what happens to their sales when we have preferential liberalization. And we find that it's not true that like all the multinational companies are actually winning. They increase their sales after preferential liberalization. Many of those multinational companies surprisingly lose. They have like they face a reduction in sales and revenue. So you have a reallocation effect of sales among the least and the most productive MNCs, even like if you focus on the most powerful economic actors, MNCs. And this creates like huge market concentration and wealth in the hands of the few. And you see that this has like dramatic also political consequences. Because when income inequality is very large, you see that like even stable political system, think about the US, has been heavily shaken because you cannot like, stop somehow the tide. Like this is becoming too much of a problem. And our study really speaks in that direction. The third project is what is the effect of trade liberalization on state-owned economies? And this is like, it's kind of like a personal obsession of like thinking about still the presence of state-owned companies in an economy. Economists usually disregard that because they are not like private actors, but for example, in my country, state-owned enterprises in Italy are still very powerful. And what I want to show is that which cost do you pay if you have a lot of like state-owned enterprises in your country? And we look at like the accession of Vietnam into the WTO. And what we find is that there is no real trade liberalization in industries in which state-owned enterprises are very powerful. Those guys are powerful enough, they're able to stop even this big bang trade liberalization produced by entering into the WTO. And so you have this underwhelming effect for Vietnam. They were hoping to get a lot of benefits in terms of like productivity and for non-economists in terms of like efficiency after joining WTO, and productivity has not like didn't grow as much as expected, and definitely no economic growth. So what we are saying here is that state capitalism is not an engine of development. If you think about China, you think about state capitalism is great because China is growing like hell. You are wrong, because when you apply the China model to other countries, results seems to be different. Future research, this is something I've just started and on which I might use your help if you're interested. This is the first research is a follow-up of my work on multinational companies. Here we want to like understand like the political game, if multinational companies anticipating gains are actually lobbying for like preferential trade agreements. And here we want to go a little bit the conventional wisdom that like what is predicting the probability of lobbying is productivity. We claim that like what is predicting the probability of lobbying for preferential trade agreements is being part of a global production network. To do that, we are like in the process of collecting data on all the lobbying documents of US firms since like early 2000. We are then going to run a firm survey in which we will ask companies to tell us if they vote in favor or against preferential liberalization. This is not something that we can get from lobbying documents. From lobbying documents, you only know how much firms are giving in favor of against a preferential trade agreements, but can be both. And then we will use web scraping techniques or alike to gather online data on firms' preference over preferential trade agreements. This is something that I will do in the summer. If you are like interested in this particular topic, I'm happy to employ an array to help us with that, maybe even two. Second project, this is actually with a new professor in the econ department, Francesco Modio. We are doing this together. We have just started, and here we want to see if actually this is it's a very controversial and ambitious project. We want to see if actually we can explain political violence using really like economic determinants. And surprisingly, like, the literature would say no. Like, political violence is often proved not be motivated by by economic conditions. So like basically like a worsening of economic conditions. We want to test this on the Palestinian territory using like a unique opportunity to have a quasi-experiment design. We will use list of production inputs banned by Israel in the West Bank, so this is not the Gaza blockade, to predict a negative effects on Palestinian firms' performance. So as a result of inputs being like banned or too expensive, you have a negative effect on firm performance. This effect is impacting some districts more than other, and we will see if in those districts in which you have like a lower firm performance, you have a more negative opinion on Israel using public opinion data. You have more like a larger number of detainees. People get arrested for political violence, and you have a higher number of fatalities among Israeli civilians. Again, we are working with this. One of you is helping us to translate Hebrew documents, and again, if you want, like, if you're interested in that, please come and talk with me. Last project, and then I will really stop because I'm like a little bit long as usual. My students know about that. It's the Italian gene, I guess. Does trade liberalization affect informal economy? Informal economy is also another like of my obsession because again, I think this is an understudy topic, especially like in economics, definitely in political science. Informal economy means like, operating in the black market. And we want to see if trade liberalization increases the probability of especially domestic firms to go informal. We are gonna like look at two countries, two developing countries, Myanmar and Vietnam, using two types of trade liberalization. Preferential one, trade agreements between ASEAN and China, and ASEAN and Japan. Myanmar is part of ASEAN, and the WTO for Vietnam. In the summer, we will like run firm surveys in Myanmar and Vietnam to try to operationalize economic informality. And we are in touch with the ILO that has a specific research agenda of economic informality to gather household surveys in Myanmar and Vietnam. This is really like a project like it's very embryonic. We are at the very beginning. Again, if you are like interested in that, please then come and talk with me. Thank you very much again for your attention, and I look forward to discuss.
So up next we have Professor Fernando Yonazia, who will be talking about LGBT rights.
Mike.
Yes.
Okay, good. You know how to work this?
Can you?
Yeah,
do
you see,
I
I know
can't
it's
see.
so complicated. Right. But, so just speak at a normal volume, and then that
All
goes in
right.
your pocket.
Okay.
And then this, I mean, you don't have a second slide.
Right. So I won't just okay. All right. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. So I thought I only had 5 or 8 minutes, so I'm going to try to go fast through it. My idea for today was to present to you one of the research projects I'm working on. This is the last project that I started to work on. Let me give you a quick background of the research question behind the project. It has to do with international law, which is what my focus is. So I am an IR in the IR field in the political science department, but I look at the relationship between international politics and international law, and all my research projects touch upon that increasing overlap between these two realms. This project has to do with the fact that international law today is still considered a consent-based system, in the sense that any international legal obligation that exists for states exists only to the extent that states have consented to burden themselves with this particular obligation, be it through practice in the case of customary international law or through treaties in the case of conventional law. And what I started to observe is that there are certain international norms that have become not only resisted by some, so the fact that it's a consent-based system implies that a particular international norm is going to become a part of international law only if there is a certain consensus amongst the international community of states. And there are clearly some norms that do not acquire this consensus. Moreover, there are certain norms that are actually polarized, which is worse than not having consensus. And LGBT rights norms, or the international LGBT rights norm, is one of those. By this I mean all those rights that have to do with prohibiting discrimination based on gender identity or sexual orientation. What you see in the case of the international LGBT rights norm is that not only there are many states that do not endorse the norm, there are actually many states that actively oppose the norm. So what we have is, to put it simply, the world divided and increasingly divided into a group of states that push for the norm to try to make the norm become a part of international law, and another group of states that have actively been working to try to prevent this norm from becoming international law. Given that background, however, LGBT rights have made its way into international law, or it is making its way into international law. But the way it's doing so is by actually going around the requirement of state consent. And this is where courts play a key role that perhaps they haven't played before. What has been happening is that, again, to put it simply, both domestic and international courts and quasi-judicial organs as well, like the United Nations Human Rights Council, they have been interpreting human rights treaties that already exist, but we do not contain any LGBT rights explicitly there, as implicitly containing those rights. So they have been reinterpreting those same texts that existed for decades as now actually implicitly containing LGBT rights. Even though it is clear in many cases, if not in most cases, that this goes against the consent given by many of the signatories of these treaties, because it's not just that LGBT rights happen to be excluded because they forgot to include them. When you look at the Travaux Préparatoires and all the discussions behind the negotiation of these treaties, many states explicitly wanted to prevent any mentioning of, for example, sexual orientation or things that one would relate to LGBT rights. So clearly, the consent of the state, or the will of many of the signatories of these treaties, was to actively exclude LGBT rights. So now reinterpreting those treaties as if they were including those rights clearly goes against what many of their signatories intended when they gave their consent to the treaty. So what I did, and I'm very proud of this mess that you see there, it's actually, this is not a result just of my work, it's also the result of meeting with a team of undergrads. There was a series of weekly discussions that we had to discuss many of these cases. I don't know if there's any of you there today, here today? No. So this happened in last summer, and then I completed it a little bit. So the idea was to come up with the network of jurisprudence that we have until today. So this looks at cases until 2015. These are all cases from either international or domestic courts but domestic courts, I'm only looking at the highest courts of a country, so the Supreme Court or the Constitutional Court, or the Court of Last Appeal for a country. I'm not looking into lower courts, because in that case, the network would be like 5 or 10 times bigger. So this is a simplified version of the actual jurisprudential network that we have. So these are all cases in which the courts have made an interpretation of a human rights treaty as granting, conceding some LGBT rights. So a pro-LGBT rights interpretation of some norm in a human rights treaty. And what these do, so the connections between these different cases, so each circle is a legal decision, it's a case. The connections imply citation. So one thing to take into account is that of all those 8 kinds of circles that you have there, all those 8 courts, let's put it that way, are independent from each other. There's no hierarchy between them. So there's no reason why one court would cite another one as you would expect from a lower court citing a precedent from a higher court. These are all independent courts. There is no formal requirement to cite another court. And what you see is that there are many of citations of one court. So one court citing its own past decisions. Those would be the blue lines. But there are also as many cross citations. So one court citing another court. We have a lot of domestic courts citing international courts. We have international courts citing domestic courts. We have international courts citing other international courts. And this is just not a coincidence. For me, what this is basically saying is, the big question is, why are courts doing this? Why are they citing each other whenever they try to put forth an interpretation of human rights as being pro-LGBT? And this is because they're trying to build legitimacy. So in that sense, they have been, let's say, tacitly becoming a collective actor in the international legal system. It's not that there is a conspiration amongst courts to try to act as an actor and go against states, but this is more of a tacit formation of a collective actor. So what we see there is that there are a lot of cross citations, not only intra-court citations, which is what you would expect, and also there are very different courts involved. For example, in case of domestic courts, there are a case from the United States, from Israel, but there are also many cases from Colombia, even from the High Court of Uganda, which is not a very LGBT-friendly country. So what we see here is a sort of judicial activism and a transnational judicial dialogue, which basically what it is trying to do is to go around the consent requirement of international law, which is today still the basis of how we understand international legal obligation. So if this holds true, so I'm presenting this paper, as I say, this week, and we'll see how the audience reacts to it. But the broader question or the broader implications is that there might be a big revolutionary transformation of our understanding of international law if this is something that courts begin to continue doing and begin to do also in other realms. So the idea would be then to expand this to other polarized norms to see if this is actually something related specifically to LGBT rights, or if it's something that the courts have been doing to try to push for norms that many states oppose. There are some works, for example, on the death penalty that clearly suggest that there has been this kind of dynamics going on in terms of trying to push for the prohibition of the death penalty, which also it's a norm that there are many states that want to prevent from legalizing that prohibition. Yeah, so that's basically what this project is. And if you have any further questions, I'll be glad to answer them. All right? Thank you.
Next up is Professor Pell.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Actually, the title of this presentation is What's All the Fuss About International Investment Treaties? So we'll be discussing.
Do you want to use this? Sure. Think you can get it on, or do you want me to hook you up? I'll get your PowerPoint. It's a PDF, yeah?
Yep.
Yeah, here we go. PSSA frivolity.
Well, the frivolity is not the PSSA
Okay,
part.
I was like,
The paper is about frivolity. Am I the surprise prof, by the way?
Yes.
Surprise! I want to tell you about the most recent project I've been looking at. This is what I worked on over Christmas and what I've been thinking about since. So much of my work is on international trade and the politics of international trade law. And here I've been looking at investment disputes. And in a way, I've been interested in exactly how different they are from trade law. So what's the original interest is that this is probably the most controversial aspect of global governance today. So if you look at the pushback within countries, right, across the entire regime, you see France and Germany trying to renegotiate CETA, the agreement with Canada, and TTIP, the agreement with the United States, because of the investment chapter. Australia has vowed not to sign any more of these investment treaties. Brazil, South Africa are turning inward. Ecuador and Bolivia are out of ICSID, the main tribunal at hand. And more, we're seeing the same pushback in Canada. And so all of this is because something called ISDS, Investor-State Dispute Settlement, whereby private firms can take governments to court if they see that governments have breached their investment obligations, right? And so this is present in NAFTA, it's present in TPP, and as I've mentioned in CETA and TTIP. And what I've been interested in is the fuss warranted, right? Why is there so much outcry, and is there a reason for it? And so what's especially interesting from a social science standpoint is that everyone's surprised, right? Policymakers are surprised, and that in a way is surprising to us as social scientists, because we usually wager that policymakers know what they're doing and they know what the consequences of what they're doing will be. And here we see the opposite. So Cecilia Malmström, who's the main EU person on this, says, you know, we've signed 1,400 of these things, this is just looking at EU countries, without any public outcry, and so why are we seeing so much pushback? The main person on the Canadian side, equally significantly surprised. Right? And so it's surprising that they're surprised. It's surprising that there seems to be something unexpected in this regime, and I'm interested in what that might be. So this is a regime that really comes, well, from even the 19th century in terms of how do you treat aliens, how do you treat foreign property, but has especially morphed in the post-colonial era when you had developed countries wanting to invest in post-colonial developing countries, but wanting some kind of insurance policy. And so these treaties come in and provide that insurance policy. Today, it's no longer that, meaning that the targets of ISDS, the targets of these disputes, are not these autocracies and questionable countries with questionable rule of law. They're mostly democracies, right? And that's the shift that I find especially interesting. And all signs are suggesting that this is something that policymakers didn't see. So when Canada and the US and EU countries signed up to these treaties, right, what is now more than 3,000 BITs, bilateral investment treaties, they didn't expect that they were going to be the ones targeted, and they didn't expect that their regulations are going to be the ones targeted. So this is a graph of the explosion of cases, and it's always talked about in terms of an explosion of cases. And there's a distinction between two types of claims: direct expropriation and indirect expropriation. And the takeaway is that both of them are increasing pretty dramatically, but the indirect expropriation is increasing more. And so what indirect expropriation is the new bit, right? So direct expropriation is what the designers of the treaty, right, thought they were designing it for. So it's what's sometimes called sovereign theft. It's when Venezuela seizes ExxonMobil assets, right? Direct takings. That, it turns out, is now a very small part of the regime. Instead, what we're seeing is this thing called indirect expropriation. And so all the most controversial cases that we see in the regime, and so closest to home, an American company, Lone Pine, has asked for compensation as a result of Quebec's moratorium on fracking. Right? But we've also done the same. TransCanada is now accusing the United States of breaching its commitments with regards to the Keystone Pipeline, and they want hundreds of millions of dollars. Right? Philip Morris is taking on Australia because of the plain packaging regulation. And Vattenfall, a Swedish company, is taking on Germany because of its nuclear ban. All these companies want hundreds of millions and billions of dollars because of regulations, right? And the laws actually allow for this. What's interesting is that we're seeing more and more of those cases. And so skip. The point is that there's a lot of ambiguity about what this actually is. The law has been dormant and is now being woken up, but lawyers don't actually know exactly what this indirect expropriation means and when it's occurring, right? And how to distinguish between indirect expropriation and legitimate regulation. And what I'm trying to argue here is that maybe firms are using these cases to scare off regulation, to temper regulatory ambitions. And so here's a press release from Philip Morris, the tobacco company, when it takes on Australia, and the highlighted section, which you probably can't read, is Philip Morris praising New Zealand on how it wisely decided to wait on its own project of plain packaging. The plain packaging in Australia is just a beige, ugly package on tobacco products without the trademark of the company. Wait until the result of the outcome of the result of the case against Australia. This is what Philip Morris loves, right? And my argument that I'm still unsure whether the evidence suggests is right or not is that more firms are doing exactly the same thing, right? So beyond this case of Philip Morris, which is probably the most salient one, we saw actually a very similar thing back in the 90s in Canada. So Canada wanted to do something like plain packaging, and these companies threatened to sue under NAFTA. Canada backs down. Indonesia tries to ban open pit mining in these protected forests, protected jungles. These mining companies threatened to sue under 2 bits, and here you have the environmental minister saying that we've had to back down because we're afraid of having to pay compensation. And so the idea is that we're seeing more and more of this, and as a result, companies are using this tool to deter regulation. And so here's the graph that I'll kind of conclude with, which is that we're seeing more and more cases, but the legal merit, meaning the legal success of those cases, is decreasing. So this is what we might expect if companies are filing these cases for reasons other than to actually obtain compensation. If they're filing these cases in order to scare off the governments in question, right? So you file more and more cases, but for what are called frivolous grounds. So you see an increase in frivolity, and as a result, a decrease in legal merit. So in the recent years, the success rate of those cases has been minimal. It's hovering around 10-15%, right? Which for any legal system is a bad sign. It means that the legal system is not accomplishing its primary task of pointing to actual violations, which is the main function of especially an international legal system. And so we can derive all sorts of other smaller expectations about how these cases would go. So for instance, that the odds of settlement, early settlement, something that lawyers always push for, should be lower when it comes to these indirect expropriation cases. And again, that's what we see. I should say this is a 45-minute talk that I'm giving in 4.5 minutes. And so the conclusion here is that the shift that we seem to be observing in this regime is real. This was intended not to be used in the way it's being used today. It was intended, for the most part, to be used against countries with poor rule of law, with non-functioning domestic courts, and instead it's being used essentially to challenge regulation in developed countries that have functioning courts and high rule of law. And there's a discussion to be had about whether that's a positive development, right? And so what we're seeing is that countries are aware of this, and they're renegotiating things like TPP and CETA on this measure. So TPP has a clause that allows you to fight off frivolous claims. Same thing in the renegotiated part of CETA, right? But none of these things have yet to be ratified. For now, we have 3,000 bits that have the old version of the rules. And in a way, what we're seeing is that these changes, while they may be good, they may also be overdue. So it's not clear whether these things will be able to be ratified precisely because there's so much pushback. And so the intent here is to try and see whether the evidence, in a way, justifies the pushback. Thank you. Do you want to grab this?
Oh, come on. There we go. Okay, so I don't have a presentation.
I love how international our group of professors are. We're from all over the world. I come from Australia. I'm also very happy to see there's at least one female professor here. So I come from Australia. I began my studies there. I did an undergraduate degree in philosophy, did a little bit of political science on the side, and did a law degree, or half of a law degree there. And then I moved to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam, where the light really went on for me because I found international law, and I was taught international law by people who had fingers in really big pies. So professors who were involved with cases at the International Court of Justice, who had been involved in negotiating the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. They're involved in the Yugoslav Tribunal. They were doing really exciting stuff. And so international law is really where my passion lies, public international law. And out of public international law, I kind of rolled into international criminal law. I did a short internship at the International Criminal Court, which was a great experience. And my PhD was on international criminal law. So I was looking at how do we hold leaders responsible for mass atrocity crimes? How do we hold the politicians and the military commanders and those higher up in insurgent organizations responsible for what their subordinates do when it comes to mass atrocity crimes? But when you're in the Netherlands doing international criminal law, you're a very small fish in a very big ocean. Everybody's doing international criminal law. Everyone's a specialist. You have to have a very niche area of research if you want to do something interesting. And so I felt like there was something else I wanted to do with my passion and commitment to state conflict, to human conflict, to relations between states, and to what public international law does when those relationships come into tension. And that was when I found space law, because obviously. So several years ago, I started reading up on it just out of my own interest, and it was what brought me here to McGill. So I just joined McGill last year, at the beginning of last year, at the Institute of Air and Space Law. And this semester I have the true joy of teaching a lot of you in the Department of Political Science. I'm absolutely loving it, because the way that you come at issues and come with questions, it's an exceptional ability that you have to look at crossover issues and to take what you're learning from different subjects and apply them to whatever issues in front of you. And that's what I love about space law. So there's a lot of space lawyers who just do space law. There's 5 core treaties to do with space, and a lot of space lawyers just kind of focus on that, and that's it. And they forget the bigger context of public international law, which is the context within which space law operates. It's still subject to a lot of the things that fit into what a lot of the other professors are researching as well, to do with consent-based relations, obligations under treaties, state responsibility. And the issues I've become very interested in are space security. So the law of armed conflict applied to space. It's everything that I was doing in my earlier research and teaching now applied to the final frontier. And I call my research Star Laws. Obviously, I was not the first person to come up with that. It was a very popular term back in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan, under the Reagan administration, they were pushing to develop a space-based defense system where they would have a lot of satellites that could sense if another country, at the time probably the USSR, were to use an intercontinental ballistic missile. It could sense it on time and it could intercept and destroy it. It was truly science fiction at the time. They were far off from having the technology that he was talking about. But this notion of using space as a high ground, being able to have that technology and that visibility a step above what your adversaries might have, that's continued. And you might imagine since the 1980s, so has technology. So why, if this is something that's not happening a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, why is this of interest today? Why is it relevant to anyone who might have interest in state relations or in tensions between countries? Well, it's because everything you see around you, someone here is recording this and later he's going to stream it and upload it onto, onto the PSSA website, and you're going to be able to watch it there over the internet, satellite technology. When you use Google Maps to find a party you're going to or to find your way to, wherever you're going on holiday, satellite technology. When you're using your mobile phones and telecommunications, satellite technology. Every time you make a financial transaction using your card or over the internet, satellite technology. So our civilian lives are highly dependent on space. We just don't see it. And you can imagine if our civilian lives are that dependent on space, that the military is probably using space in very similar ways. GPS was a military invention, right? It was the US military that came up with a way of being able to use satellite imagery and remote sensing, so they're taking photos of the Earth and then using the satellites to track where they are, and we now use that in our everyday lives. Satellite telecommunications, when they're in remote areas, they have big sat phones. Internet communications, they use it for tracking troops, for tracking movements of ships. They use it for tracking GPS guidance of airplanes, which, by the way, is the same every time you take a flight. It's dependent on GPS for the flight traffic. They also have GPS-guided weapons. So there are weapons using those satellites that are not steered by a pilot, they're steered by satellites. Drones, all of this kind of thing. So the more you have developed countries using these high technologies and becoming dependent upon them, they actually become vulnerable. China, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, France, any developed country that you can think of, and I put China in that category, is using satellite technologies and using space for its military capabilities to a very high degree, which means what's a good way to take out your adversary is to take out their means in space. So space becomes a very potential domain for conflict. The final frontier it's right here. So a lot of people think I'm talking about what might happen in 20 or 50 years. I'm talking about what's going to happen in 2 to 5 years. It's really upon us. And one of the biggest problems is that issues of targeting, so international humanitarian law or law of armed conflict was one of my previous fields. It has a lot to do with the rules of the game when you're fighting a war. And you may not believe it, but most of the time, most parties to a conflict adhere to those rules, most of the time. One of the problems with terrorism is that they go right against the rules. But some of the key rules are that you have to distinguish between civilians and military. So you can target anyone wearing a uniform or anyone identifiable as a member of the military. You cannot target a civilian. That also means you can't target schools and hospitals. But you could target public buildings, depending on whether they are actually feeding into an adversary's capabilities. So what happens when you're talking about targeting satellites? It becomes really problematic because the GPS that you and I are using might come from exactly the same satellite that the GPS that the Canadian military is using. Our telecommunications, same satellites. So they're called dual-purpose satellites. And it becomes very difficult to identify which of these satellites might you be able to justifiably, legitimately target. Because if you take out a satellite that's providing us with all of our services, it's not just Facebook that's going to fall out. Our entire digital existence hangs upon that. It's not just your ability to find your way or talk to your best friend. It's your ability, you can imagine what would happen to the financial system if all of a sudden nothing could happen digitally. You can also imagine there are more serious services that we depend upon. So tracking climate change, tracking what's happening. We can track the movements of refugees, for instance. We've been able to track some international crimes based on being able to observe what's happening with these satellites. If this stuff was taken out, the collateral fallout on the civilian side might be disastrous. So there's very difficult questions about being able to identify which satellites could be targeted, how to target them. If you destroy them, for those of you who attended the talk I gave a while back, a month or so ago, about law and politics in space, space debris is a huge problem. If you were to destroy a satellite, you cause so much space debris that becomes this exponential continuation of creating more and more space debris, which then creates more and more damage to the satellites that are there. So it has this kind of roll-on effect. So these are the questions that I'm looking at. Unfortunately, I don't have access to a budget to hire an undergrad student to work on this because the projects that we're doing in the Institute of Air and Space Law, we tend to hire students who are doing a Masters of Law degree in the Institute. But there is a project I'm involved in which might interest some of you, which has to do with my interest in space security. And it looks at security issues across the board. It's an organization called Women in International Security, or WISE. It was founded in Washington, D.C. It has chapters all around the US, and it has a Canadian affiliation, WISE Canada. And it has two main purposes, I guess. The first is to really give a voice to women in international security. So those of you interested in security issues and international relations, any gender issues and conflict situations. It's to give you a voice as upcoming academics and your voice for a future career. The other side is really a networking one, and that's very much for men and women who are interested in those issues. It's not a women's club, right? It's a club for gender issues and international security. I'm very much involved in that organization. There's a conference coming up in June this year, which you can, if you want to find out more about, I'm happy to speak about. And next year in 2017, we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of WISE Canada. And I'm very much involved in putting that together. We're putting it together with University of Montreal and together with McGill and a few other universities and some government representatives as well. So they're the things that I would love to have you involved in. Thank you.
Last but certainly not least, I'd like to present one of my favorite professors here at McGill University, Professor Manuel Alan. Let's get yours up. You all right?
Yeah, I think so.
Where's
Okay.
the play button?
Here.
Easy. Keynote. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this is your clicker.
Okay.
Here.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for the invitation to PSSA. Thanks for the introduction. It's great to be here and present the research that I'm doing right now. As we were talking with Christophe, we've coincided at these brunch research a couple of times already, so diversified people. Anyway, so what I'm going to be presenting now is a very ongoing project that has a conference attached to it, which is happening next week, which is why I chose to present this, because, well, I want you to go to the conference next week, basically. So let me try to pique your interest. The project is called What's Left? The Left Turn in Latin America 15 years after, right? And let me give you a little bit of a background of what we're talking about here. Starting in 1998, there's been a significant left turn. I'm not going to use this because I walk back and forth. There's been a significant left turn in Latin American politics, right? With the election of Chavez in 1998, what we've seen is most countries turning to the left in terms of their electoral preferences, right? And so we've seen this in Venezuela, we've seen this in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Chile, in Paraguay, very briefly, in Guatemala, in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, in you name it, right? There's been a number of different countries that have switched to the left. The exceptions are very few. Mexico, only a couple of votes away. Colombia, well, is civil conflict away. And other very marked cases, right? And existing research has tried to explain why we've seen this left turn, okay? Some of the conditions that people have talked about have to do with, structural levels of inequality in Latin America and a claim for redistribution, right? This is why people would elect the left. Others have talked about, the transition to democracy and the fact that for the first time almost in history, the whole region is democratic and has been democratic for a couple of decades now. Other people talk about more contextual causes, right? So economic conditions between 1998 and 2002, economic downturn. This hurt incumbents, eroded support for market policies, which was sort of the name of the game in Latin America at that point in time. And others, right? And they've also explained why it was so sustained in time, why it lasted as long as it did. People talked about high economic growth due to commodities boom, right, during these years. So the economy is going up. There happens to be leftist governments there. They happen to be reelected, right? This is not very surprising. And also in terms of this high economic growth, we see funding to sustain certain societal and leftist distributive policies that wouldn't have been possible under other economic circumstances. And also people have talked about diffusion, sort of this regional trend, right? My neighbor elects the leftist government, therefore, I'm more likely to elect the leftist government. But this has been sort of the analysis that we've seen on the left turn in Latin America. Now, I want to call a little bit your attention to how significant this left turn has been, right? This is unprecedented. Unprecedented in Latin America for sure, and in the world, I don't know. I don't study the whole world. I'm mostly about Latin American politics. But this is pretty significant, right? Where we see a whole region turning to elect leftist governments within the same decade. And those leftist governments being re-elected over and over again. And I don't think it's a matter of debate, in democratic elections. You know, there's issues here and there, but elections have been mostly clean and fair. So historically, leftist victories are sort of short-lived and they were rare in the region. There was a little bit of a shift to the left in the 70s, and that was quickly squashed away by the military. The other thing is, until 2015, only one leftist government was elected out of office. That happened in Chile, and they were re-elected again into office 4 years later. Another was removed in what they called an institutional coup in Paraguay after a couple of years. And in the rest, we saw re-election up until 2015. By most measures, and those measures have been criticized because of unreliability in the production of information, of economic information in a number of countries, significantly Argentina, where both Fernando and I are from. So taking this with a grain of salt, redistribution has taken place in most of the region. Poverty is down, inequality is down. I suggest that you take a look at this book by Hubert and Stevens that analyzes this exact same question in 2012, right? So a couple of years have gone by and things have changed a little bit. And another focus of research has been, there's been different trends within these cases of leftist governments. Some talk about social democratic left in Chile, Uruguay, Brazil, and radical or populist left in Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua. Some include Argentina in this category as well. These are simplistic categories, but they catch upon something that is significant. There's a lot of differences among these cases, right? Some of these differences also have to do with the level of institutionalization of the left. So whether it was an established party that came to power, or whether it was a sort of new political movement, whether this is a personalistic leader, type Chavez, think Chavez, or more of a party organization, think, if you know about it, Lula and the PT, the Workers' Party, right? And other differences that are there. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about what we are doing, how we are inserting ourselves here. And this is a collaborative project, and that's why I'm talking about we, right? We seem to be at the end of this pink tide, of this left turn, right? And there's a couple of indicators for this. There's an economic downturn in the region that has to do with, a number of different factors. The positive outcomes that I described earlier, and that I can show you some graphs that I took out just for time purposes about decreases in inequality and poverty. These sort of improvements are either slowed down now, or they have come to a regression in a sense. There's been presidential turnover in Argentina last year. Bolivia, Evo Morales, the president for a number of years since 2006, has lost the referendum. He won't be able to stand for re-election again. There's a deep crisis in Venezuela. There's a deep crisis in Brazil going on right now. There's an upcoming election in Peru where the leftist candidate was banned from run, right? And there's no leftist candidate there. So we see that this sort of left turn is no longer there. And so what this project tries to do is to take stock, to think about, okay, we've had 15 years of left turn. And by the way, all of these conditions weren't there when we started the project, which was a year and a half ago. We started thinking about this. And so it's kind of, on some levels, unfortunate that this is going on. From a research standpoint, this is good timing for us, right? We're getting ahead of the curve in a sense, right? People are going to be talking about this in a while, and we designed this project a year and a half ago, and so now we get to jump on it right now as the crisis is going on in Brazil, as a number of different things go south. So we look at three large themes here. So one is simply to evaluate what has happened during this decade and a half, right? Evaluate actually to what extent there have been changes, policy changes, to what extent this has actually been a left era in Latin America, and to what extent it's been more of the same repackaged in a different way. So to what extent there have been changes and continuities. The other theme is how has performance matched up expectations? So when the left came to power, people elect leftist governments. We've never been with a leftist government in 20 years, and that leftist government lasted 2 years. We think redistribution, we think a number of different things should happen. Well, now it's 15 years later. We can see whether performance has matched expectations or not. It hasn't on a number of levels, right? But we get at these questions, and I'll tell you in a little bit exactly how. And most importantly, and the part that I think is the most interesting aspect of the project, is how have societal demands changed, right? Because for a while, you are governed by mostly a neoliberal type government that, doesn't pay much attention to participation, inclusion, redistribution, et cetera, and then you get the leftist government that you hoped for on some level, right? And then these governments perform, mixed records, as we all know. And then what happens to those societal demands? To what extent those societal demands shift? And shift in what direction, right? Are we talking about people saying, okay, now I have my cash transfer program, I'm okay, I'm above the poverty line, but hey, redistribution, more, let's address inequality. Or now I want health, I want education. Or is it different? Is it that people, now have these things and they're like, oh, underperformed, let's go back to market, I want competition, I want other things, right? And so how have these societal demands changed? And not only at the individual level, but also at the aggregate level. How different societal groups have changed their relationship with the state, right? And I'm jumping ahead. And so what we look at is a couple of different sort of big issues here. And this is a multidiscipline type of project. And you'll see why. The framework is a very much poli-sci project, right? But when it comes to doing the actual research on each one of these questions, we have to bring in historians, sociologists, anthropologists, geographers, lawyers, economists, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a number of different things that we're going to talk about. The first one is democracy and institutions. And this has been one of the main critiques that people have had of the New Left. Yes, you've had some economic success on some levels, but institutions have gone south, right? People don't care anymore about the process. It's about what happened at the end of the tunnel, right? And so we've had some, regression in terms of institutions and rule of law, right? And this is one of the themes that we will be discussing next week. The second theme has to do with social movements and the New Left. So what happens when you are this civil society movement, this union, this group in society, right, that wants to elect a leftist government at some point, and that during decades and decades plants itself in the opposition to what many would consider center or center-right governments. Now a leftist government is elected. How do you deal with that? So we've seen a great deal of co-optation here. Different movements that have been brought into the government. And by being brought into the government, you lose that autonomy to stand against and criticize. And this is another theme that we will be looking at. Another one has to do with human rights. Why? Because a number of these leftist governments have been very proactive in looking at state repression during the 70s and 80s and trying to advance justice. In Brazil, there was a truth commission more than 20 years later to revise what had happened during the dictatorship. In Argentina, there's been a number of different people involved in repression that have been pursued by the criminal justice system. There's a number of things going on with regards to the past. Now, human rights violations happen in the past, and they happen currently, and they happen during democracy. And there's been far less attention to that. So we're going to analyze sort of this balance of looking at human rights and the selection of different topics when it comes to human rights that these governments have picked on. Prison conditions is one that people have forgotten about entirely. Another theme has to do with inclusion and exclusion patterns. So in the last 10, 15 years, what we've seen is the emergence of LGBT movements, of more gender movements in a number of countries where gender wasn't really a main sort of axis by which people were organizing themselves. We see environmentalist movements, we see indigenous movements gaining more power. And so what has been the reaction of different governments with regards to these new demands that have emerged, right? And whether they've been inclusive of them or pushed them to the side. Another one has to do with environment and extractive industries. Big preview in terms of environment and environmental policies. The left hasn't been very good. So they pay more attention to development than to the sustainability of it, right? And so we're going to look at this as well. One of the main criticisms when it comes to what has happened in the last 10, 15 years is people feel more insecure than they did before. Growing urban violence, growing crime. What have these governments done to address these things? More than rhetoric in terms of policy, and how have these things changed through time, right? So these are sort of the 6 axes. And as you can see, we need to bring sort of, lawyers and anthropologists and geographers and, sociologists and a number of people working up from different subfields and different disciplines to look at this. So it's 2 political scientists, we're running the show, right? And then we're bringing in all of these people to help us answer these questions. So as I was telling you, there's an upcoming conference next week that I can send you more information on. This is the poster. It's what's left. You may have seen the poster around. You can't read anything there, so I blew those up. And so it's March 23rd and 24th. It's at Banque, which is the library / public archive in Old Montreal. This is March 23rd and 24th. Throughout the day, there's 6 panels. There's a cocktail. There's musicians at the cocktail. There's a photo exhibit at the conference as well. So we are going full out. And if you saw this before, the reason that we're doing all of this and we're able to do all of this is you see all this big chunk of the poster, all the sponsors, right? And one thing that I wanted to call your attention to is this is part of a new network to study Latin America that we've created here in Montreal that includes all 4 universities and every single social science discipline in every department. So we have a number of people coming together to collectively think about Latin America. And this has been something that we've been missing here at McGill and in other universities, that we don't have enough focus to, enough capital to really go at these regional questions because, there's only 2 Latin Americanists in the poli-sci department, 1 in sociology, et cetera, right? And so we're grouping resources from all 4 universities to do this. The conference will be mostly in English. We're doing the introduction in French, English, Spanish, and Portuguese. But, the beauty of doing social science in Montreal, I guess. I look forward to seeing you there. We're still needing some volunteers and some things, so if you are interested and have some time, come see me, and I'm sure we'll find stuff for you to do. Thank you.
If you guys do want more information with regards to that conference, PSSA will have a poster up on our Facebook page as well as poster, so you guys can have that information reiterated to you. Thank you to all our professors, Professor Belan, Professor Pell, Professor Nunez, Professor Steer, Professor Bertini for coming. Thank you all for coming. Please, one more round of applause for all the wonderful professors. And feel free to stick around for another 20 minutes. We have the room till 1. Should they be willing to stay, you can approach them with questions about their research. They are busy, so let them go if they, please grab some food. And if you do have garbage, please make sure to throw it out. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you so much. I hope that worked.